Hey guys, it's Standing for Truth coming to you tonight. Just want to go over a few things, kind of spur of the moment. For one, I want to really recommend the debate from last night. Very engaging, very much entertaining. But I really want to recommend everybody watch it because I think it's the best example we have at how little the evolutionists of today that want to fight against biblical creation actually look into and study our literature. Because if you're using the most up-to-date arguments for creation, and an evolutionist comes in ill-prepared, with little of anything of substance to provide, a lot of it is going to be based on misunderstandings and misrepresentation. So I thought it was funny because in a comment section, a comment thread, TJump and I were discussing pre-existing heterozygosity, and he was making some complaints that he didn't quite understand what was meant by pre-existing heterozygosity, pre-existing functional DNA differences, because that created heterozygosity hypothesis makes direct predictions. And we spent a great deal of the first little bit of our discussion portion going over those predictions, but the fact that he admitted he didn't understand what these pre-existing DNA differences were is very telling, and kind of explains a lot of the misunderstandings in regards to a lot of what was being discussed. So I highly recommend watching it. My opening presentation, I go over a ton of evidence for biblical creation and a literal interpretation of Genesis. I go over some fatal blows to evolutionary theory. What's nice is there was no rebuttal to any of that. And even in the closing statement, where you'd think that a couple of the things that were left hanging from an opening statement would be addressed, but they weren't. I think his closing statement was about a couple minutes max. And the things that he brought up in his opening, in regards to predictions, fossils, mammal to reptile, transitional fossils. For one, I addressed that in my opening with nested hierarchies and how we predict mosaic creatures, and that it's a competing explanation. And that's why we need to look to genetics, because that's what's going to distinguish between both models. So the predictions he even brought up were already dealt with. And I dealt with anything that was left hanging in the closing statement. So, I mean, at the end of the day, that's how a debate works. So what I'm going to do here is just share screen for 1 second and play the very beginning of my opening statement in regards to pre-existing heterozygosity. And you tell me if I explained it well enough, because when you're using words like pre-existing DNA differences, pre-existing heterozygosity, pre-existing genetic diversity, anybody who comes prepared for a debate like this should probably understand what is meant by that, especially if what is understood in the evolution model, and that these DNA differences, say these tens of millions of nuclear DNA differences, are assumed to be mutations. And then I'm telling the evolutionists that under the model of created DNA differences, functional DNA differences, those are encoded, created functional differences from the start. And that's how we would explain speciation, of course. So let's get right into that real quick. As I'm sharing the screen, watch the debate with an open mind. Lots of fun, very engaging. Okay, so I am going to start it right now. We look to the created heterozygosity. Hypothesis. At the end of the day, based on the fact that God and his command to be fruitful and multiply, probably didn't want that to be carried out by cloning. We look to this created DNA differences placed into the created kind, placed into Adam and Eve. So if you have these heterozygous ancestors, that's just a fancy way of saying pre-existing diversity. An almost limitless variety of combinations of chromosomes, genes, and traits are possible. And starting with those heterozygous organisms, based on that placement of encoded DNA differences, visible distinctiveness in offspring is going to be quick. With this amazing and designed functional heterozygosity, though, even at a tiny fraction of their nucleotides, through the processes of gene conversion and recombination, so it's not even just mutations. Mutations would provide a little diversity, but it's gene conversion and recombination that we look to, and that would provide essentially an unlimited range of useful diversity that would be produced. And of course, this model makes testable predictions, so hopefully we get into that in the discussion portion. But these design variants would be expected to be created within useful linkage groups and would have originated at high allelic frequencies. And like I said, this hypothesis makes testable and falsifiable predictions. Now, starting from a literal interpretation of Genesis, we could... Okay, so after listening to that, I hope everybody could see clearly that, I explained, actually, this wasn't the first time I explained it either. You can listen to the discussion portion, pre-existing DNA differences, pre-existing genetic diversity, pre-existing heterozygosity. God encoded these DNA differences to Adam and Eve and the created kinds at the start of their existence. I mean, at the end of the day, it's pretty straightforward, actually. And anybody who understands even basic evolutionary theory knows that for the evolution model, all differences in nuclear DNA are due to mutations, but in the creation model, differences in these sequences are due to design and obviously some mutations, but the greater portion due to design. And as I said, in the discussion, when we're looking at these DNA sequences, if we have that starting point of pre-existing DNA differences, pre-existing heterozygosity, well, a direct prediction that we're going to make, obviously, is that these DNA differences are functional, because if they were created with function, well, when we sequence these genes and look for function and assume that they are functional, that's exactly what we're going to find. So that's a testable prediction. And heterozygosity, anyways, it just means millions of differences in DNA sequences of chromosome pairs. And like I said it many times, these were built into organisms from the beginning by their creator. So we're going to look to functional DNA differences when we're doing our studies on DNA function. And at the same time, long periods of time are not going to be required for the production of these new species. So as I said, with those heterozygous ancestors, the organisms, visible distinctiveness, speciation, and offspring is going to be quick. I talked about how gene conversion and recombination are going to be beneficial in the production of the new variety, not just mutations. And at the end of the day, this makes the testable predictions that I was talking about. And if you look to the actual literature on non-coding DNA, we're saying that there's functionality for the vast majority of the genome. And I said that many times as well. So ENCODE has suggested that at least 80% of the human genome is functional. They're preliminary, but the trajectory is clear in the fact that most of this non-coding DNA in the human genome is functional and serves in a regulatory role, regulatory capacity. But gene knockout tests are the gold standard of science. So that prediction is actually slowly being confirmed by accumulating papers. And I've talked to many evolutionary scientists in my discussions and debates, and evolution says that at the end of the day, there's going to be much non-functionality, maybe 20% max is what they'll say. And we're predicting that it's going to be the vast majority of the genome that's functional. So that's a novel prediction that we're actually seeing come true. And even in the end there, I mean, we're seeing in finch populations that based on this model, new distinct species of finches are arising due to these shifts in, heterozygosity to homozygosity, resulting in new species. So all of this is consistent with observed evidence. We're making the testable predictions. It's also making predictions on mitochondrial DNA mutation rates and allowing us to identify what's related and what's not in regards to the created kinds, because we're looking at functionally unique differences, obviously across families if they're not related, and functionally neutral DNA differences within, because they actually share ancestry. So there's a ton of predictions, ton of it's just a short video, guys. Just wanted to point out the fact that a lot of these evolutionists, they'll go into these debates unprepared. They don't even look into, their opponent's literature, their opponent's arguments, and then they're left misunderstanding the model at hand. And at the end of the day, go watch the debate. It was a lot of fun. It was very engaging. TJump's seems like a nice guy, cool guy. The debate went by fast, but a lot of evidence was presented for biblical creation, and a lot of evidence was presented against evolutionary theory as well. So even in my presentation, I went over a lot of their claim best evidence, say chromosomal 2 fusion, pseudogenes, obviously some of these shared genetic mistakes, ERVs, and none of that was addressed. So I went over in the closing statement about the fossil record and a lot of the transitionals he was talking about. And when you're making so many predictions like the evolutionists do, and so many weak predictions, because the type of predictions they're making in regards to these transitional forms, you can see just based on looking at vehicles, whether it's a four-wheeler and say a tricycle, and I'm going to predict that, there must be a bicycle somewhere in there, and lo and behold, that's exactly what you find. So these predictions, some of them are confirmed, but there's so many of them that are not being confirmed, that are failed predictions, that the majority proves the world. And the creationists are the ones making the testable, falsifiable predictions in the realm of genetics. So you know what? I look forward to more debates and discussions like this. And for anyone who hasn't watched it, go watch it, have some fun. And everybody, have a good night.